Welcome, gentle traveler through time, to tonight's peaceful journey into the quiet corridors of ancient history. Whether you find yourself winding down after a bustling day or simply seeking a moment of tranquil reflection, I am honored to have you join me here. Please, settle comfortably wherever you may be listening, and know that across the world, others like you are finding solace in these whispered tales of bygone days. If these gentle historical wanderings bring you a sense of calm, you are most welcome to return for more such restful stories. Now, let me transport you to a world of sun-baked limestone and flowing river waters, where the sands of time have buried secrets that would make even the most learned scholars pause in wonder. We speak tonight not merely of another Egyptian queen whose story was lost to history's vast tapestry. Rather, we delve into the mystery of a woman who may have challenged the most ancient and powerful religious institutions in the known world, who possibly wielded more authority than any female ruler before her time, and who might have ruled all of Egypt under a completely different identity than the one history remembers. In this gentle evening's tale, I shall guide you through the windswept halls of Amarna, that forgotten capital which our mysterious queen called home. We shall explore the whispered rumors that swirled around her relationship with the revolutionary pharaoh Amenhotep. We will uncover the startling evidence suggesting she commanded power beyond anything previously imagined for a woman of her era. And we shall investigate the most compelling theories about what truly became of Egypt's most enigmatic ruler. By our story's end, you will understand why Ankhesenamun was far more than merely another beautiful face gracing an ancient throne. She was a master of political intrigue, a religious revolutionary, and quite possibly the most formidable woman in all of ancient Egypt. And that very formidability might explain precisely why she had to vanish so completely from the pages of history. But first, let me paint for you a picture of the world into which Ankhesenamun was born. For without understanding the magnificent chaos that defined 14th century Egypt, you can never truly comprehend the magnitude of what this remarkable woman accomplished. Picture, if you will, Egypt as the undisputed master of the ancient world. The pharaohs controlled territories stretching from the golden mines of Nubia far to the south, all the way to the great Euphrates River in what we now call Iraq. Gold flowed like water from Nubian excavations. Tribute poured in from vassal states like honey from the comb. The temples of Amun-Re and Thebes had grown so incredibly wealthy that they rivaled the pharaoh himself in power and influence. Into this world of unimaginable wealth and rigid tradition stepped a young prince named Amenhotep, who would later be known to history as Akhenaten. And somewhere in the royal courts, either as a princess from a foreign land or as the daughter of Egyptian nobility, a girl named Ankhesenamun was preparing for a destiny that would shake the very foundations of Egyptian civilization. Here is where most historians stumble in their understanding. They paint Ankhesenamun as merely the beautiful wife who obediently followed her husband's radical religious reforms. But the evidence tells a completely different story. From the very moment she appears in the historical record, Ankhesenamun is portrayed not as a subservient queen, but as an equal partner in power. For ancient Egypt, that was not just unusual. It was virtually unheard of. Let me tell you about the first time we truly see Ankhesenamun in action, for it presents a scene that would make any modern power couple envious. Picture the great temple of Karnak in Thebes, where for over 1,000 years, the ancient rituals had been conducted in exactly the same manner. The air was thick with incense, gold gleamed from every surface, and thousands of worshippers prostrated themselves before the hidden god Amun-Ra, whose very name meant the concealed one. Into this sacred space came Akhenaten and Ankhesenamun, but they were not there to worship. They were there to revolutionize. Instead of honoring Amun-Ra, they began construction of temples to a completely different deity, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun. Here is the detail that most people miss. in the reliefs and inscriptions from these early temples, Ankhesenamun is not standing dutifully behind her husband. She's right there beside him, making offerings to the Aten, wielding the sacred was scepter, and performing rituals that traditionally only pharaohs were permitted to perform. The priests of Amun-Ra must have been absolutely livid. For over a millennium, they had been the power behind the throne, the kingmakers who legitimized pharaonic rule through their divine connection to the hidden god. And now this young couple was essentially telling them that their god was obsolete, that the only deity worth worshipping was one that anyone could see simply by looking up at the sky. But Ankhesenamun and Akhenaten were just beginning their revolution. Around the 5th year of Akhenaten's reign, they made a decision that sent shock waves throughout the ancient world. They abandoned Thebes entirely and built a completely new capital city in the middle of nowhere. They called this place Akhetaten, which means horizon of the Aten. Today we know it as Amar-An-A. Founding a new capital might not sound particularly dramatic to our modern ears, but in the ancient world, this was essentially declaring war on the established order. Thebes was not just a city. It was the beating heart of Egyptian civilization, the place where pharaohs were crowned and where the gods themselves were believed to reside. By abandoning it, Akhenaten and Ankhesenamun were announcing that they needed neither the old gods, nor the old priests, nor the old ways of conducting royal business. And Ankhesenamun's role in this revolutionary city reveals just how unprecedented her power truly was. Archaeological evidence from Amarna shows us something that would have been absolutely unthinkable in traditional Egyptian society. There are temples where Ankhesenamun alone makes offerings to the Aten, without Akhenaten present anywhere in the scene. There are artistic depictions where she is shown smiting Egypt's enemies, a role that was exclusively reserved for pharaohs throughout Egyptian history. Most shocking of all, there are inscriptions that refer to her using pharaonic titles and epithets that no queen had ever been permitted to claim. Let me share with you one specific scene that perfectly captures just how radical Ankhesenamun's position really was. It is carved on the walls of a rock tomb in Amarna, and it shows the royal family in their private quarters. But this is not your typical formal Egyptian art with its standardized ritualized poses that we are accustomed to seeing. Instead, the Aten's rays stream down from above, while Akhenaten and Ankhesenamun play with their daughters in what appears to be a moment of genuine domestic bliss. But look more closely, and you will notice something extraordinary. Ankhesenamun is not portrayed as the smaller, subservient figure that Egyptian queens typically were in royal art. She is depicted as the same size as Akhenaten, positioned as his equal partner. And in some scenes, she's actually shown as larger and more prominent than the pharaoh himself. This is not merely artistic license. This is a visual declaration that Ankhesenamun wielded power that was equal to, or perhaps even greater than, that of the pharaoh. The more we examine the evidence from Amarna, the clearer it becomes that Ankhesenamun was not just a queen in the traditional sense. She was a co-ruler in the truest meaning of the word. And this unprecedented power arrangement would have created enemies for her throughout the Egyptian establishment. Consider the displaced priests of Amun-Ra, the traditional nobility who had been pushed aside, the military commanders who watched Egypt's empire begin to crumble, while the royal couple focused on religious revolution instead of foreign policy. All of these powerful groups had one thing in common. They wanted the old order restored, and Ankhesenamun stood directly in their path. But here is where our story takes an even more intriguing turn. Around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, something happens that changes everything. The royal couple, who had been portrayed as inseparable partners in their religious and political revolution, suddenly begin to appear separately in official art and inscriptions. Ankhesenamun starts showing up alone in contexts where she had previously been depicted alongside a Khenaten. At first, historians assumed this meant the couple had experienced some kind of falling out, perhaps a disagreement about the direction of their religious reforms. But recent archaeological discoveries have revealed a far more fascinating possibility. What if Ankhesenamun did not fall from grace? What if she was actually being elevated to an even higher position of power? Around the same time, a mysterious new figure begins appearing in the historical record. Someone called Smenkhare, who bears all the titles and regalia of a pharaoh. For decades, Egyptologists could not figure out who this person was. Some thought it might be one of Akhenaten's sons. Others suggested it could be a previously unknown co-ruler. But then, in a discovery that sent shock waves through the archaeological community, researchers found evidence that Smenkhare and Ankhesenamun might be the same person. The hieroglyphic inscriptions, the artistic depictions, even the physical artifacts all point to an incredible possibility. Ankhesenamun did not disappear from power. She was transformed by it. Think about the implications of this for a moment. If Ankhesenamun really did become pharaoh in her own right, she would not just be unique in Egyptian history. She would be absolutely unprecedented. Yes, there had been female pharaohs before, like Hatshepsut, but they had typically ruled as regents for young male heirs or in times of extreme crisis. Ankhesenamun would have claimed the throne at the height of her power, as the culmination of a religious and political revolution that she had helped to orchestrate. But becoming pharaoh would have made her even more dangerous to Egypt's traditional power structures. A foreign queen who challenged the old gods was one thing, but a female pharaoh who threatened to permanently reshape Egyptian civilization, that was something the established order simply could not tolerate. And that brings us to the central mystery that drives our investigation. If Ankhesenamun really did become pharaoh, if she really did wield unprecedented power in ancient Egypt, then what happened to her? Why does she vanish from the historical record so completely? And most importantly, was her disappearance voluntary, or was it something far more sinister? The answers to these questions lie buried not just in the sands of Egypt, but in the tangled web of ancient politics, religious warfare, and palace intrigue that defined the final years of the Amarna period. To understand what really happened to Ankhesenamun, we need to delve deep into the world of her enemies, for trust me, she had plenty of them. Let us start with the man who had the most to lose from Ankhesenamun's rise to power, General Horemheb, who would eventually become pharaoh himself. Picture this individual as the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a military strongman, a career soldier who had spent decades building his power base while watching the empire that his predecessors had built slowly crumble under Akhenaten's neglect of foreign affairs. Horemheb was not just any general. He was the sort of man who understood that power flows from the point of a spear, not from prayers to some sun disk that most Egyptians had never heard of before Akhenaten's revolution. While Ankhesenamun and her husband were busy building temples and composing hymns to the Aten, Egypt's vassal states in Syria and Palestine were falling like dominoes to rival powers. The gold that had flowed from Nubia was being threatened by rebellions, and Egypt's reputation as the ancient world's superpower was hanging by the thinnest of threads. For Horemheb, Ankhesenamun represented everything that was wrong with the new order. Here was a foreign woman, possibly not even of royal blood, who had somehow maneuvered herself into a position where she was making decisions about Egypt's future. From his perspective, she was not just a threat to traditional religion. She was a threat to Egypt's very survival as a great power. But Horemheb was intelligent, enough to understand that he could not move against Ankhesenamun directly, not while Akhenaten was still alive, and the couple maintained their united front. So he waited, building alliances, consolidating power, and preparing for the moment when the Amarna experiment would inevitably collapse under its own contradictions. Then there was Uya, Ankhesenamun's own father-in-law. And here is where our story becomes truly twisted. Uya was what we might call the ultimate political survivor, a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of Egyptian court politics for decades. He had risen from relatively humble origins to become one of the most powerful men in Egypt, largely by positioning his family as the perfect connection to the royal house. But here is the thing about political survivors like Uya. Their loyalty is always conditional. As long as Ankhesenamun's power served his interests, he was her greatest supporter. But the moment the power became a liability, the moment it threatened his own survival, Uya would have had no qualms about sacrificing even his own family to preserve his position. By the 14th year of Akhenaten's reign, there were plenty of signs that the Amarna experiment was becoming a liability. The traditional priesthood was growing increasingly restless. The military was losing faith in the royal family's ability to defend Egypt's interests. The common people were beginning to question whether the Aten really cared about their daily struggles for survival. In the midst of this growing crisis, something extraordinary happens that gives us our first real clue about Ankhesenamun's fate. Archaeological evidence from this period shows us that someone began a systematic campaign to restore the old gods alongside the Aten. Temples to Amun-Ra were quietly reopened. Traditional festivals were allowed to resume. Diplomatic relations with Egypt's neighbors began to improve. This was not Akhenaten's doing. The man who had spent his entire reign trying to erase the old gods from Egyptian memory would not suddenly reverse course and start compromising with his enemies. No, this careful political maneuvering bears all the hallmarks of someone far more pragmatic. Someone who understood that pure ideological revolution was a luxury that Egypt could no longer afford. This bears all the hallmarks of Ankhesenamun's handiwork. Think about it from her perspective. She had achieved something no woman in Egyptian history had ever accomplished. She had claimed the throne as pharaoh in her own right. But what good is a throne if the kingdom you are ruling is falling apart around you? What good is unprecedented power if wielding it means watching Egypt collapse into chaos? So Ankhesenamun began what might be the most brilliant political pivot in ancient history. She started quietly undoing the most extreme aspects of Akhenaten's religious revolution while maintaining the appearance of loyalty to the Aten. She reached out to the displaced priesthood, offering them a path back to relevance. She began rebuilding Egypt's military and diplomatic relationships, restoring the empire's strength while carefully preserving her own position. But this balancing act was incredibly dangerous, and it created even more enemies than she already had. The hardcore supporters of Akhenaten's revolution saw her as a traitor who was selling out their cause for political convenience. The traditional establishment did not trust her motives, viewing her concessions as nothing more than tactical retreats in a larger campaign to preserve her illegitimate power. And then there were her own family members, people like Uya, who were beginning to calculate whether their interests would be better served by supporting Ankhesenamun or by finding a way to replace her with someone more manageable, someone who could be controlled. The pressure was building from all sides, and something had to give. That something was Akhenaten himself. Around the 17th year of his reign, the pharaoh who had turned Egyptian civilization upside down simply vanishes from the historical record. No death announcements, no funeral inscriptions, no tomb that archaeologists have been able to definitively identify. Had Akhenaten died of natural causes? Had he been assassinated? Or had Ankhesenamun herself decided that her husband had become more of a liability than an asset to her plans for Egypt's future? The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. But one thing is clear. With Akhenaten gone, Ankhesenamun found herself in an even more precarious position than before. She was now a female pharaoh ruling alone, without the legitimacy that had come from her partnership with a male ruler of undisputed royal blood. She was trying to navigate between the conflicting demands of religious conservatives who wanted a complete return to the old ways and revolutionaries who viewed any compromise as betrayal. And she was doing all of this while Egypt's enemies abroad sensed weakness and began testing the empire's defenses. It is at this crucial moment that we get our most intriguing piece of evidence about what happened next. Hidden away in a minor tomb at Amarna, archaeologists discovered a cache of documents that paint a picture of palace intrigue worthy of a modern political thriller. These papyri, written in the hurried script of government clerks, record a series of secret meetings between Ankhesemen and various power brokers in the Egyptian establishment. The documents are fragmentary and often cryptic, written in the kind of coded language that ancient conspirators used to avoid leaving incriminating evidence. But they paint a picture of a woman who was desperately trying to secure her position, while the ground shifted beneath her feet. In one papyrus, we see Ankhesemen apparently negotiating with representatives of the Amun-Re priesthood, offering to restore their temples and return their confiscated wealth in exchange for their recognition of her legitimacy as pharaoh. In another, she is corresponding with military commanders, promising them resources for campaigns to restore Egypt's crumbling empire. But the most fascinating document is a letter that appears to be from Ankhesemen herself, written in her own hand to someone identified only as the one who knows the ancient ways. In this letter, she writes about her fears that the enemies of Maat gather like jackals around a wounded lion, and her determination to preserve the two lands even if the cost is higher than the heart can bear. What did she mean by that cryptic final phrase? What cost was Ankhesemen prepared to pay to preserve Egypt? And who was this mysterious correspondent who knew the ancient ways? The answers to these questions would determine not just Ankhesemen's fate, but the future of Egyptian civilization itself. Because as the 18th year of what had once been Akhenaten's reign dawned, the beautiful queen who had come to rule Egypt was about to face the ultimate test of her political skills. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the ancient world. And at its center stood a woman whose name meant she lives for Aten, preparing to discover whether beauty, intelligence, and unprecedented power would be enough to survive the deadliest game in human history, the struggle for absolute power in ancient Egypt. But before that final confrontation could play out, Ankhesemen would make one last desperate gambit, a move so audacious that it would either secure her place as Egypt's greatest ruler or ensure her complete erasure from history. And that gambit would involve the one person Ankhesemen had never been able to fully trust, her stepson Tutankhamun, the boy who would inherit everything she had fought to build. Picture this scene, if you will. It is early morning in the royal palace at Amarna, and the sun's first rays are streaming through the massive windows that Akhenaten had designed to let in as much of the Aten's light as possible. But instead of the harmonious family gatherings that had once characterized the royal household, we now see a much more tense dynamic playing out. Ankhesemen sits across from a teenager who barely reaches her shoulder, but whose bloodline carries the one thing her political maneuvering cannot manufacture: unquestionable legitimacy as a descendant of the ancient pharaonic dynasties. Tutankhamun, probably no more than 9 or 10 years old at this point, fidgets under the intense gaze of the woman who has essentially been his stepmother, his co-ruler, and now potentially his greatest threat. What we know from the archaeological record suggests that this meeting was not just a family chat. Ankhesemen was proposing something that would have been absolutely unprecedented in Egyptian history, a formal partnership between herself and the boy king, with her maintaining actual power while he provided the legitimacy that came with his royal bloodline. Think about how desperate this move really was. Here is a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades accumulating power, who had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of religious revolution, who had potentially murdered or exiled her own husband to secure her position. And now she is essentially asking a child to validate her rule. But Tutankhamun was not just any child. Despite his youth, he had grown up watching the political games that swirled around the throne. He had seen how Ankhesenamun had gradually accumulated power, how she had maneuvered herself from queen to co-ruler to pharaoh. And he had advisors, powerful men like Yuya and Harmheb, who were whispering in his ear about what his base future should really look like. The boy's response to Ankhesenamun's proposal reveals just how sophisticated the political calculations had become, even among Egypt's youngest players. According to fragmentary inscriptions found in the Valley of the Kings, Tutankhamun essentially told his stepmother that he would agree to her terms, but only if she agreed to begin the process of returning Egypt to its traditional religious practices. This was not just a religious demand. It was political genius wrapped in the language of piety. The young king was essentially forcing Ankhesenamun to choose between her ideological convictions and her practical need for legitimacy. If she agreed, she would be betraying everything she and Akhenaten had fought for. If she refused, she would be giving the boy, king, and his advisors the perfect excuse to move against her. Ankhesenamun's response to this ultimatum shows us exactly why she had survived so long in the deadly world of Egyptian palace politics. She did not refuse outright, and she did not agree immediately. Instead, she bought herself time by proposing a gradual transition, a careful reintegration of the old gods alongside continued worship of the Aten. But while these negotiations were playing out in the royal palace, events beyond Amarna's borders were rapidly spinning out of control. Egypt's enemies had been watching the internal power struggles with growing excitement, and they sensed that the empire's moment of maximum weakness had finally arrived. The Hittites, Egypt's greatest rivals for control of the ancient Middle East, began moving troops toward Egyptian territories in Syria. The Nubians, who had been providing Egypt with gold for centuries, started questioning whether they really needed to keep paying tribute to a kingdom that seemed to be tearing itself apart. Even smaller powers that had never dared challenge Egyptian authority began testing the empire's responses to various provocations. This external pressure created exactly the kind of crisis that Ankhesenamun's enemies had been waiting for. Harmheb, in particular, seized on Egypt's military difficulties to argue that the kingdom needed strong traditional leadership to survive. He began circulating among the Ani's commanders, painting Ankhesenamun as a foreign influence who had weakened Egypt by prioritizing religious experimentation over imperial defense. The general's arguments were compelling because they contained enough truth to be dangerous. Egypt really had lost territory during the Amarna period. The empire's military really had been neglected while the royal family focused on building their new capital and promoting their new religion. And Ankhesenamun really was the most visible symbol of everything that had changed during those turbulent years. But Harmheb made one crucial miscalculation in his campaign against Ankhesenamun. He assumed that she would respond to pressure the way most politicians do, by becoming defensive, by trying to explain away her failures, by gradually retreating from her positions. Instead, Ankhesenamun did something that caught everyone off guard. She went on the offensive. Picture this moment, because it represents one of the most audacious political moves in ancient history. Rather than waiting for her enemies to move against her, Ankhesenamun announced that she was personally leading a military campaign to restore Egyptian authority in the north. She would take command of the army, march into Syria, and prove once and for all that the new order she represented was strong enough to defend Egypt's interests. The reaction to this announcement was immediate and explosive. Traditional Egyptian society simply had no framework for understanding a female pharaoh who wanted to lead troops into battle. Queens were supposed to stay in the palace, managing domestic affairs and providing heirs. Even the most powerful women in Egyptian history, like Hatshepsut, had ruled through surrogates and advisors rather than taking direct command of military operations. But Ankhesenamun was not asking for permission or trying to conform to traditional expectations. She was essentially betting her entire political future on her ability to succeed where Egypt's male rulers had recently failed. If she could restore Egyptian control over the disputed territories, if she could bring back tribute and prisoners and proof of victory, then no one would be able to question her legitimacy as pharaoh. The preparations for this campaign revealed just how thoroughly Ankhesenamun had thought through the political implications of her gamble. She did not just gather troops and supplies. She carefully selected which commanders would accompany her and which would remain behind in Egypt. She made sure that her most trusted supporters were positioned to maintain control of key government functions while she was away. And she arranged for Tutankhamun to remain in Amarna, under the supervision of advisors she had personally chosen. But the most revealing aspect of Ankhesenamun's military preparations was how she presented the campaign to the Egyptian people. Rather than framing it as a desperate attempt to shore up her failing regime, she portrayed it as the natural culmination of the religious revolution that she and Akhenaten had begun. The Aten, she proclaimed, was not just the god of Egypt, but the god of all nations. By extending Egyptian control over foreign territories, she was actually spreading the true faith to peoples who had been living in ignorance of the sun disk's universal authority. This was not just imperial conquest. It was a holy war fought on behalf of the one true deity. This religious framing of her military campaign was politically brilliant because it transformed Ankhesenamun's greatest weakness into a potential source of strength. Critics had always argued that Aten worship was a foreign innovation that had no place in Egyptian religion. Now, Ankhesenamun was essentially arguing that Egypt's imperial mission was to bring this superior religious understanding to the rest of the world. The army that marched north from Egypt in what was probably the 19th year of the Amarna period was unlike any force that had ever taken the field under pharaonic command. At its head rode a woman wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, followed by carefully selected commanders who had sworn personal loyalty to her rather than to the traditional military hierarchy. The troops themselves were a mixture of Egyptian regulars and foreign mercenaries, bound together not by shared ethnicity or traditional loyalty to the pharaonic institution, but by their commitment to the revolutionary ideals that Ankhesenamun represented. These were men who had been marginalized under the old system, soldiers who saw in Ankhesenamun's rise to power proof that merit and loyalty could triumph over birth and tradition. But as this unprecedented army made its way toward the contested territories of Syria, events back in Egypt were moving in directions that would ultimately prove far more decisive than anything that happened on the battlefield. Yuya, Ankhesenamun's own father-in-law, was having a series of very private conversations with some very important people. The old man had watched his daughter-in-law's increasingly desperate political maneuvers with growing alarm, and he had reached a conclusion that would have devastating consequences for the woman who had made his family's rise to power possible. Ankhesenamun had become too dangerous, not just to Egypt's traditional order, but to her own supporters. Her military campaign was either going to succeed spectacularly, making her politically untouchable, or fail catastrophically, bringing down everyone associated with her regime. Either outcome posed serious risks for a man like Yuya, who had built his career on being indispensable to whoever happened to be in power. So Yuya began reaching out to other power brokers who shared his concerns about Ankhesenamun's increasingly erratic behavior. He spoke carefully with representatives of the old priesthood, suggesting that perhaps the time had come for a more moderate approach to religious reform. He had quiet conversations with military commanders who had remained in Egypt, exploring their thoughts about the kingdom's future leadership needs. Most importantly, he began spending more time with the young Tutankhamun. gradually convincing the boy that his stepmother's ambitions were putting the entire royal family at risk. Yuya painted a picture of a woman who had lost touch with political reality, who was gambling Egypt's future on increasingly desperate schemes to maintain her illegitimate hold on power. The old advisor was particularly skillful at exploiting Tutankhamun's adolescent insecurities. Here was a teenager who had grown up in the shadow of one of history's most powerful women, who had never been allowed to exercise real authority despite his royal bloodline. Yuya whispered that Ankhesenamun saw the boy as nothing more than a useful figurehead, someone to be manipulated and controlled, rather than respected as a legitimate heir to the pharaonic tradition. These conversations were having exactly the effect that Yuya intended. By the time reports began filtering back from Ankhesenamun's military campaign, Tutankhamun had been thoroughly convinced that his stepmother represented a threat to everything he should rightfully inherit. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not just who ruled Egypt, but what kind of civilization the kingdom would become. And then, just when the political situation seemed like it could not become any more complicated, something happened that changed everything. A messenger arrived in Amarna with news from the north that would either vindicate Ankhesenamun's desperate gamble or provide her enemies with the perfect excuse to move against her once and for all. The reports from Syria were mixed, which in the deadly game of palace politics was almost worse than outright failure. Ankhesenamun's forces had won some battles and lost others. They had managed to restore Egyptian control over several important cities, but they had also suffered significant casualties and failed to achieve the kind of overwhelming victory that would silence all criticism of her leadership. More troubling still were the reports about Ankhesenamun's behavior during the campaign. According to soldiers who had returned to Egypt, the female pharaoh had personally participated in several battles, fighting alongside her troops in a manner that scandalized even her supporters. There were stories about her interrogating prisoners, making strategic decisions without consulting her commanders, and conducting religious ceremonies that seemed to blend traditional Egyptian practices with completely new rituals. These reports created a perfect opportunity for Ankhesenamun's enemies to move against her. Yuya, Horemheb, and their allies began circulating stories about a queen who had been driven mad by power, who was endangering Egypt's military by treating warfare like some kind of religious ritual. They painted her campaign not as a heroic attempt to restore Egyptian authority, but as the reckless adventure of a woman who had completely lost touch with reality. Tutankhamun, now fully convinced that his stepmother posed a threat to his rightful inheritance, agreed to put his name to a proclamation that would effectively end Ankhesenamun's reign. The document, carefully crafted by Yuya and his allies, announced that the young king was taking personal control of Egypt's government to protect the kingdom from the dangerous innovations that had weakened it during the Amarna period. The proclamation was a masterpiece of political propaganda. It did not directly attack Ankhesenamun or accuse her of any specific crimes. Instead, it presented Tutankhamun's power grab as a reluctant response to circumstances beyond anyone's control. The young king was simply doing his duty to Egypt and to the gods by restoring traditional order to a kingdom that had been led astray by well-intentioned but ultimately misguided reforms. But the most devastating aspect of the proclamation was how it reframed Ankhesenamun's entire career. Rather than acknowledging her as a legitimate pharaoh who had ruled Egypt in her own right, it described her as a regent who had served admirably during Tutankhamun's minority, but who had unfortunately overstepped her proper authority. She was not being overthrown. She was simply being asked to step aside now that the rightful king was old enough to rule. This careful language was designed to give Ankhesenamun a face-saving way to accept her political defeat. If she agreed to return to Egypt and resume the more traditional role of Queen Mother, She could maintain her dignity and probably her life. All she had to do was abandon her claims to pharaonic authority and accept that her unprecedented experiment in female rule had come to an end. The Heartfelt proclamation was dispatched to Syria with great ceremony, carried by messengers who had been carefully instructed to present it as an opportunity for reconciliation rather than an ultimatum. But everyone involved in its creation understood exactly what they were really offering Ankh-Senaman: surrender now, or face the consequences of continued resistance. What happened next would determine whether the woman who had called herself Pharaoh would accept political defeat gracefully or choose to fight to the bitter end. The answer would reveal not just Ankh-Senaman's character, but the true nature of the revolution she had tried to lead. And that answer, when it came, would be so shocking that it would echo through Egyptian history for the next 3,000 years. The messenger who carried Tutankhamun's proclamation to Syria must have expected to find a defeated woman ready to accept the inevitable. After all, what could one isolated female pharaoh do against the combined forces of Egypt's traditional power structure? But when he finally located Ankh-Senaman's camp near the ancient city of Damascus, he discovered something that would have sent chills down the spine of anyone who understood Egyptian politics. Ankh-Senaman was not just still fighting. She was winning. The reports that had filtered back to Egypt had been deliberately distorted by her enemies to make her campaign seem like a desperate failure. In reality, Ankh-Senaman had achieved something that no Egyptian ruler had managed in decades. She had not only restored Egyptian control over the disputed Syrian territories, she had pushed further north than any pharaoh since the great conqueror Thutmose III. More importantly, she had done it in a way that created genuine loyalty among the conquered populations. Instead of simply demanding tribute and submission, Ankh-Senaman had established a new model of Egyptian rule that combined military strength with religious tolerance. Local gods were incorporated into Aten worship. Local customs were respected. Local leaders were given real authority within the Egyptian administrative system. This was not just military conquest. It was political genius. Ankh-Senaman had created a buffer zone of genuinely loyal subjects who would defend Egyptian interests, not because they were forced to, but because Egyptian rule had actually improved their lives. For the first